Data protection and privacy teams are under more pressure than ever with new laws, AI oversight, data breaches, and the constant expectation to do more with fewer resources.
That's why TrustArc built a modern privacy and data protection management platform powered by Arc Intelligence. It unifies your tools, automates the work that slows you down, and surfaces what matters most right when you need it.
From guided quick actions to our intelligent assistant, Ask Arc, you get credible, contextual answers backed by expert research, not generic AI guesses.
Finally, privacy that works the way privacy pros work.
Learn how TrustArc helps teams move faster with confidence at trustarc.com/serious-privacy. That's trustarc.com/serious-privacy.
You're listening to Serious Privacy, powered by TrustArc. Here are your hosts, Paul Breitbarth, Ralph O'Brien, and Dr. Kay Royal.
Summer is approaching fast, and that also means that the world of data protection is speeding up to get things done before the summer. Whether it's legislative initiatives, fines from regulators, or other things happening around our community, a lot of people want to wrap them up before, on the European side, probably somewhere mid-June, end of June, before the 2 months of summer bliss kick in, where there is absolutely nothing to do, work slows down, people go on vacation, and we all just sit outside having our cold drinks in the long grass. So if only that were true. But enough to discuss this week. My name is Paul Breitbarth.
My name is Ralph O'Brien.
And I'm Kay Royal, and welcome to Maybe Not So Serious Privacy. I should have picked a question that related to that. Y'all know I just pull them up randomly. Here's one. If you were about to die, but were allowed one song to listen to, which one would it be and why?
One song.
One song. In your case, I would change it to one piece of music.
Okay. Then it would be the 8th Symphony from Dvorak, The New World.
Beautiful, cultured.
That took them no hesitation.
It's a song, it would be Piano Man.
Oh, Piano Man, not bad.
I like that.
I wish I could think of something funny to say, but all that's over my head is going up to the Spirit in the Sky at the moment. So,
Nice. I like that. So, for me, funny enough, I can't choose between two songs. There's a third song. Oh my gosh. Jack and Diane has always just been the song that speaks to me the most. So we're going to go with Jack and Diane.
Lots of things to talk about this week, including, I think we were going to start by talking about the much-awaited GDPR simplification.
Yes. Slightly underwhelming doesn't cover it. Massively underwhelming even doesn't cover it. We were promised a big regulatory relief for lots of companies across the European Union. All mid-cap companies would receive administrative relief under the GDPR. Well, the proposal came out on the 21st of May. We've looked at it, and it seems that the threshold for mid-cap companies will be set at 750 employees or 150 million euros in turnover, according to the guidance of the European Commission, although the proposals for the GDPR specifically only talk about the 750 employee threshold and not the monetary threshold. And if you are under that threshold, what you get in return is that you do not have to do your records of processing activities for the non-high risk data processing operations. And then the data protection authorities, when creating guidance, also need to specifically think of you. That's their obligation. So all this big rumor about GDPR simplification, and we're getting rid of administrative burden for lots of organizations and lots of things that they do. No, it is just basically a few records of processing activities fewer that you need to do and that you need to document.
I've always had an interesting take on is Article 30 just replaced the requirement to register with individual supervisory authorities, with just having an overview that the supervisory authority could review quickly. So I've always seen Article 30 as actually a relatively small job, provide an overview of your processing for the regulators to look at if they want it, because it uses words like categories. Whereas actually a lot of organizations, will through Article 30 do what they'd call a full data inventory, where when an organization needs to do that anyway under Article 24, I would say, Article 24 says demonstrate that your processing is in accordance with the law. So to me, that is actually under Article 24 is when you need to do your full data inventory to prove that your data processing is in full adherence to the law. So to me, this restriction on Article 30 from 250 to 750 means that organizations of an extra 500 strong, unless it's high risk, don't have to do a summary for the regulator. Now, you could tell me I'm wrong here and that I've misinterpreted it. Certainly, when you look at the ICO's website, their template for Article 30 goes way beyond what Article 30 actually says and looks more like a full data inventory. But to me, not only is it perhaps disappointing to those people who wanted major reform, but to me, it's the minimal of minimal relief because of Article 30's misunderstanding itself, perhaps.
I'm not completely sure that I agree with that perspective, but then again, I'm in the EU and you are not. I do think that Article 30 is slightly more than the registration that you used to do with the Data Protection Authority in the past as an organization, because it is that dynamic internal record that you need to keep. It needs to cover all your data points, all your data elements that you are collecting, where it is coming from, where it is going to, what the data transfer mechanisms are. So that also now includes a reference to your transfer impact assessment. If it is high risk, it needs to include the references to your data protection impact assessments. If it's AI, it needs to include a reference to your AI fundamental rights impact assessments in case of high risk. So I do think that the intention of Article 30 is slightly more directed towards the data inventory as we know it today. But obviously you are right when you say, but Article 24 accountability doesn't go away. So even though you may only need to keep your processing activities records for high-risk processing activities, you still need to understand all of your processing operations and have some sort of record of them, because you need to be able to demonstrate what you consider high risk and why the rest is not high risk.
So the example I've always used is in Article 30, it says you need to know, or you need to write down in your Article 30 ROPA categories of recipients. That's what it says. It says your categories of people who you're going to give data to. Now, if I just write down the categories, I could say vendors, suppliers, government agencies, customers, the categories. When you look at Article 24, we'd have to write down a lot more than that to demonstrate compliance. Who each individual customer was. Do I have a contract with them? What's the security on the transfer mechanism? How much am I transferring? For what purpose, right? What are they going to do with it? Who might they send it to? So I actually think for Article 24, you've got to write down a lot more than, which is what it says in Article 30, which is simply categories of recipients. To the words in the law, that's why I've always taken that view, going to the exact words in the law. Now, how supervisory authorities have interpreted after that, of course, is a different matter. But
that's for sure. Plus, if you combine the articles as you should do when you build out your program, then the conclusion is unavoidable that you will need a record of some sorts in any case. So to just introduce this mid-cap threshold for the register of processing activities, it's a nice gesture, but I don't think that for a lot of companies it will make a lot of difference, and it certainly won't save them a lot of money or time.
And as you pointed out, what being in the EU, it won't apply to the UK in the first place.
No, because you are still debating whether or not to change your legislation, and if so, to what extent and what regulatory relief you would be offering to people. There is a lot of cosmetic changes that I saw the last time I read the law, but where are you now?
We're almost there. The Data Use and Access Bill has got 8 parts. It is through every stage of government. Now it's gone through the Lords, it's gone through the Commons. And actually, all of what I'm going to call the fundamental data protection changes, which are things like compatible secondary purposes, pre-approved legitimate interests, modifications to our e-privacy PECA laws to make the fines the same level as the GDPR. getting rid of the ICO itself and replacing it with a commission. There's not any question on any of them. There's no argument on any of them. So I don't see any of that changing going through into the final version. The only argument we are left with is literally a lady called Baroness Kidiron, who every day is standing up on behalf of the House of Lords and actually asking for an insertion of the AI copyright provision, which basically says that if you are going to rip off other people's copyright, if you are going to ingest training data, perhaps is another way of putting it, you should at least quote their source in any outputs that you create, so that you know when, where and how that copyright materials come from, so people whose copyright is invoked can then go after royalties or they need for the creative industry. And then what happens is, and this has been going on for about 3 weeks, by the way, the very next day, it goes back to the Commons. And this is something we call ping pong, where, literally, if there's anything that we can't stand, it goes to the Lords, the Commons, the Lords, the Commons, the Lords, the Commons, until one or the other gives up.
So there is no referee who can just call the shot and say, this is the result, and you have to make do with it.
There's normally a softening from one side and some sort of compromise made in the end. However, this time there doesn't appear to be any compromise. What tends to happen the very next day is it goes to the Commons, and Peter Kyle, who is the MP responsible for data protection in the UK, on behalf of the government, he's just removing it and shooting it down and saying that it should be done on an opt-out basis, that after your data has been ingested into these tools, then the artists can go and ask to opt out.
Which is impossible because then the training has happened.
Yeah, that's weird.
Yeah, that is weird.
Yeah, so we've got this ping pong status, and that is the only thing stopping the data use and access bill from going forwards, this copyright provision, which is interesting because for me as a data protection practitioner, there's a lot more squeaky things in it from a data protection angle than this copyright thing. But that is the only thing that's stopping everything. So it's basically any day now. It's literally until either the Lords or the Commons gives up or compromises. Of course, if the Commons do win, Elton John and a consortium of 100 artists have said they're going to take them straight to court anyway.
And would that then block the entry into force of the legislation, or would that be a fully separate process?
It would be a fully separate process. The legislation would come into force. You have to remember, actually, the data use and access bill does actually a number of different things. It's not just data protection focused. It also does a number of things about digital identity providers and a number of other subsequent things as opposed to just data protections. It's 8 parts and only 2 of them look at data protections. But again, as you've already said, Paul, it's another layer of changes to the law. What they've tried to do is not make it so much of a change that we lose adequacy. But again, if you put like little exemptions all the way through the law, it lessens the effect to the extent that businesses will feel that they can ignore it's got such an impact upon them. And then you add on that a commissioner who has gone public again saying that, we're going to hang off enforcement a little bit, and which you could argue, how can you hang off a virtual zero? The combined effect of that is going to be very much reaching here, regardless of what it says on the paper.
Interesting. So, yeah, we look forward to hear from you when the law has been approved, and then it still should get royal assent and then be published somewhere, and then by the summertime, probably when people start going on vacation, it should enter into effect, or is there also a transition period still foreseen?
There will be a transition period. But and that will vary depending on each individual proponent of the law, believe it or not. So, I mean, and again, it isn't passed yet, so anything could happen in the next half hour, but really it's this last AI ping pong that's kind of causing the delay, and it would have been passed, a couple of weeks ago had it not have been for this sort of ping pong process around AI and copyright. In fact,
a massive data breach tomorrow, or a theft, or another incident, and the whole thing may be topsy-turvy.
Exactly. And as you remember, with its predecessor, it was a parliament running out of time that caused the problem, right? So who knows what can happen in the next half hour, right?
When you started this conversation, Ralph, I thought there was going to be a knockdown drag out between the UK and EU, whether or not UK was going to actually pass a law to make the EU happy.
Yeah, the European Data Protection Board have gone on record looking at the European Commission's 6 months extension to UK adequacy and kind of gone, yeah, we'll let it happen, but don't do it again. See the European Commission's point, actually. What's the point of deciding on adequacy this summer if the law's about to change and they've got to review it again? So
Right.
I kind of do actually see it in this case.
I actually thought it was the other way around because adequacy, of course, expires in June.
Yes.
The EDPB mainly pointing out we don't know whether the UK will finally pass a law, so just extend the adequacy for 4 years instead of 6 months, because we don't want you coming back to us every 6 months if the UK can't get their parliament together behind one single bill.
Yeah, true.
So that was the frustration that I read between the lines. We've been talking about this new law for so many years, so just do the adequacy and don't come up with these extensions every single time.
I'm tired of talking about it, trust me. Talking about AI, actually, I've got one for Kay here, because we've been talking on this podcast about the proliferation of state AI laws going through the books in the US. And as I understand it, the US, was it 2015 to 2014, has imposed a 10-year moratorium on state AI laws and automating
The budget.
Kay, I don't know if you've got any more information on that you could tell us.
So in here, it's basically, if it passes, it is going to be challenged straight out of the gate. So there will be more to come on that, trust me.
Yeah.
So yeah, we need to monitor the budget debate, right? Because this is one of those sentences in a 10,000-page budget bill that is somewhere hidden, but somebody did find it in the end, even though that was not the intent.
Yeah.
And then add to that from the US, the Take It Down Act as well for non-consensual online sharing of intimate images. As I understand it, Kay, that's also another law that's come through with some hidden bits and pieces in it that has been suggested could curtail freedom of speech, or am I reading that wrong?
Exactly. So that one I was really excited to see when it was first proposed. But as you say, when you start getting into the details of it, it's not as positive as it sounds.
Why not?
Because people are always trying to sneak in some things they shouldn't sneak in.
Okay, so it's not about the principle of the law. That's not as good as it sounds, but it's all the details that are put
It's
into the
the
legislation.
details, as Ralph was saying, it actually does not do a good job of defining what parts of sexually explicit content, how are you going to prove it's without consent? How are you going to make sure that they remove it within 48 hours? So there's a lot of issues in here where sometimes they got a little too detailed and sometimes it's not something that they can actually easily prove is sexually explicit content without consent. Because again, very famous photography of naked child running from a bombing, that would be a sexually explicit image uploaded without consent because nobody even asked the child's consent to take the picture. So that's probably the best example of what this might start applying to. But I'm absolutely delighted to get more into the details of this one and then let y'all know as it progresses what we can do. The deep fakes are
But
also one of the
stupid
things.
thing is that your legislative proposal, by the sound of it, is not that much different from what Europe has adopted under the EU Digital Services Act. Because also there, it talks only about illegal content without actually defining what constitutes legal content.
Right.
That needs to be taken down. This is completely different from the CSAM proposal, right? Where it's the scanning of the images. But this is, the Digital Services Act is really reporting based. So if you see something that you don't like, you should be able to report it to the platform as illegal content, and then they should take it down, whether it is fully consensual or not, whether it is out of context or not. That then needs to be assessed by the platform, and then you get all kinds of freedom of speech issues.
Yeah, just because I don't like you doesn't make me illegal.
And this is the non-consensual pornography is something that I've been watching for years and years. So I was very excited to see this. I don't think the law as passed is as problematic. Some make it out to be, because like you said, it aligns with the laws in some of the other countries. But I do believe there are going to be some pieces of it that are going to be very difficult, one, to actually act on, and two, to actually enforce.
Yeah, it's so difficult with online content because, I mean, I think we can all agree that something should be illegal, but, I don't necessarily agree that naked equals sexual, for example. Nudity is not necessarily sex. So there's an interesting definition right from the start. And then once you then start talking about harmful content and people being able to complain about literally just things they don't like to see. As I said, one person's religious commentary could be another person's hate speech. One person's good education is another's indoctrination. So hard. I wish I had a silver bullet.
Yeah, exactly. Love that the law passed. Not sure how it's going to work the way it is because the deep fakes is another aspect of it, but absolutely thrilled that we took this action on a federal level.
It's also surprising that there is actually legislation coming out of this administration and not just executive orders.
Oh, yes, there's legislation. And even if the legislation is going to be fought on several different aspects, whether this legislation or the former that we were talking about, the AI ban, I expect that we're going to see a lot of activity around the laws regardless. But to be fair, AI moratorium should never happen. Non-consensual porn takedowns should absolutely happen.
I think there we agree on both counts.
So I was reading an article from the great Carey Lemming the other day, who's produced some beautiful articles recently. And the one I was reading most was about Meta's use of AI or to take in historic data for AI training, not under an explicit optional consent, but under legitimate interest, which I think most of us would agree is potentially unlawful under the GDPR. That Facebook
potentially.
Okay, fair enough. I was being politic. So we're actually recording this on May 28, 2025. They actually started doing that on May 27th, 2025. You may have missed the window to turn that off if you haven't turned that off already. But certainly, even if you missed that window, the news here is that our good friend Max Schrems and his organization NOYB, NOYB.eu, has certainly issued a formal cease and desist letter, again arguing that legitimate interest is unlawful and looking for EU-wide injunctions.
And it's not just them. Also, the Irish Data Protection Authority and also the Norwegian Consumer Council have asked Meta for formal clarifications on the legal basis of their activities.
Yeah, but I think what's interesting about the NOYB is NOYB have got themselves registered now as being able to undertake class action lawsuits. So I think looking at damages for a huge number of affected users, that could be an interesting space to watch in terms of not a GDPR penalty, but a core issue damage or distress penalty.
Yes and no. Damages are nice, but that doesn't mean that the harm isn't already done.
True.
So I would much rather see a very strict order from a data protection authority. Stop doing this, delete what you have done, ask people for consent, and if they agree, then you can start building your AI. But you need to delete what you have done right now because you have no legal basis. Legitimate interest going forward as of yesterday? Sure, that works. Then you can offer an opt-out. Legitimate interest for anything historical? It just doesn't exist because it's not a compatible use case.
No, I don't disagree with you, Paul. I do think that, sometimes money talks. And sometimes with the regulators, you can be a little bit tricksy. A good example might be the IAB judgment, where the court process or even the regulatory process takes a long time. And by the time the judgment's out, the IAB will turn around and say, "Oh, we've got a new version now." And that new version's completely different. So let's start again.
Regulators also need to be smart in how they regulate and how they write their decisions. But yeah, if only I was the supervisory authority for Meta right now, my hands are itching. Okay, one of the fun things actually of doing a podcast is that every once in a while I get really good questions from people that we can also discuss on the show. And as a couple of weeks ago, you talked about the California Consumer Privacy Act and some of the enforcement action was happening. And somebody sent in a question related to CCPA and nonprofits. What if a nonprofit were to engage the services of a fundraising company with mailing lists of many thousands of potential donors? Would that contractual relationship with a fundraiser cause the nonprofit to no longer be exempt if the number of persons that they are contacting exceeds the threshold of, 50,000 persons? So how does this nonprofit exemption actually work?
It's really interesting because when the CCPA was first proposed, I actually wrote a LinkedIn article on this. So nonprofit entities are not explicitly exempt from the CCPA. The pertinent language is in the definition of a business, which is in that definition section, the 1798.140. So if you go and you look at the definition of a business, and I'm pulling it up right now so I can speak about it. Hold on, let me pull that up. It talks about business is a sole proprietorship, partnership, blah, 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 operated for profit or financial benefit of its shareholders or their owners, is also the same phrasing found under the definition of service provider. So when it talks about for the profit or benefit of its members, that's mean not all nonprofit entities are exempt. Maybe they meant to exempt them. If you go back historically and look at the language proposed to pass the CCPA, which we know the originators were not happy with, therefore the amendments with the CPRA. But they talk about when nonprofits act to benefit its members, and they're not pure charity organizations like the Bar Association or the Medical Association. They don't exist for a nonprofit reason. They exist for the benefit of their members. So that's one thing you'd have to look at. Does this nonprofit exist for the benefit of its members and not for a pure charity organization reason? So that would be one. The other would be, let's pretend that the nonprofit is exempt and they're sharing data for these mailing lists or whatever they're doing. My husband just brought me a Dr. Pepper. Woohoo! So if they're sharing the data for these mailing purposes, the mail house itself may not be exempt. Hold on. The mail house itself may not be subject to the CCPA directly because as service providers are not subject directly.
So this is not a black and white answer where you can say, well, if this applies, then that applies.
Exactly. The service providers are only subject to the CCPA if they're not directly subject through the activities of the businesses that they're doing services for. So if that business is exempt, then that activity with the service provider, if they're not otherwise subject to the CCPA, would not be subject to the CCPA. Just because they have thousands and thousands of people's contact information doesn't mean they're subject to the CCPA as a service provider for that. So you have to go through several levels of analysis to determine whether this is good or bad. But hold on, there's more. You mentioned if there's a breach. The breach is subject to the data breach notification laws, which are not the CCPA. Those are separate laws that all states have had in place for a long time.
That's 1,000 citizens in California?
No, actually, the breach laws apply, period, across the board. You'd have to go look at the definition of breach and the definition of data and all of this. But typically what it boils down to is if a company has a situation where data that includes first name or first initial with last name in combination with other factors, which an email address would typically not subject it to that. But let's say they had their donation history or their financial history or their medical information, then it would be subject. And even if it's just one, there are things you have to do under the law to notify that person, provide certain protections. But it's typically once you hit 500 or 1,000 that you would then have to notify the Consumer Protection Agency for the state or the Attorney General. So all states are a little different in that. My favorite resource for state data breach notification laws is through the law firm Mintz-Levin, and they call it the Mintz chart or something like that. They keep it updated. I love it. They give the links to the actual law so you can do a skim of the table presentation, figure out if it meets, and then go to the actual law and read the word of the law to make sure that you're falling in its definition. But yeah, so having the list of donors at a mail house, not necessarily subject to California law, having a breach, you absolutely are subject to state data breach notification laws.
I've only had to do it a couple of times. You've had to go to a US company, look up what particular state or customers are from, and then look at the various thresholds for reporting to both individuals and the Attorney General in each state.
Yeah.
Not fun. We actually have it easy in Europe.
That's why I'm so happy using Nimity Research, where you can just find all of that in the zip of a moment.
Serious Privacy, sponsored by TrustArc Nimity Research, apparently Dr. Becker.
Yeah. And I will tell you, there's the unspoken rules as well. So some states say, I think it was Massachusetts, forgive me, I'm off the top of my head, that originally said you could not tell consumers what caused the breach. Every other state, the notification letter had to include the cause. So how do you comply if it's in multiple states and they conflict with each other? So I believe that was resolved. But when you talk about the others, and some say it's a notification requirements and some don't, what we've seen is that you cannot defend that in court. If you have a breach that crosses multiple states, and in some states you'd notify people and in some states you wouldn't, the courts have said that's not treating all of the data subjects equally. If you notify some, you should notify all. And yeah, I've had situations where incidents where one of our vendors had an incident. God, I'm trying to recall this off the top of my head. One of the vendors had an incident, or their vendor. So you're talking your fourth, fifth, or sixth party had one, and someone along the line made the decision that they didn't have to notify everyone equally. They only notified those within the same state that qualifies. So some had medical information and some didn't. So they only notified those with medical information. What if these people were in the same household? And you notify one person in the household, but not the other two because only one had their medical information? How is that fair? And I think I remember telling this vendor service provider years ago, I'm sorry, that apparently is our client's decision to make, and apparently they made that decision with you. It would be a different decision for me. If it was my call to decide who to notify, you'd be notifying everyone. Note that down.
I agree. I double down on that.
Very clear. Before we wrap up, Ralph, I think you had one more fine, actually, that we should talk about.
Yeah, this is the Italian Garante, which I know I say it every time, but I love their naming convention, the guarantee of the protection of personal data. I think that's a beautiful thing. It's much more heartwarming than the IDPC or the DPC or the ICO.
Or the CNIL.
Oh, that is in it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a lot to be said about independent supervisory authorities, especially as some of them are now becoming market surveillance authorities for AI as well. But that will vary from member state to member state. But the Italians have come up with a 5 million fine on a company called Luca Incorporated, who was a creator of an AI chatbot called Replica. Now, this chatbot is one that we've talked about on previous podcasts that have a virtual companion, let's put it that way, a confidant, a therapist, a romantic partner, a mentor of 5 million euros, is based on a few different things, actually. No legal basis for processing, apparently. No transparency information, or at least failed to deliver clear transparency information, and lacked age verification, including allowing minors to encounter inappropriate content, and also a lovely little Article 31, which is not cooperating with the regulator as well. Just to add insult to injury here. They're pretty much ticking all the boxes on the way down, and a 5 million fine they consider to be proportionate and dissuasive, of course. Now, this is under GDPR, not under the AI Act.
No, and their fines could even be slightly higher, certainly for misleading the regulator, because then you go up to 7% of turnover. So that could become very interesting. But well done for the Italian supervisory authority. Okay, any final points from your side of the world before we wrap up?
My final point would be, who in their right mind argues with a regulator during investigation?
Yeah.
Self-righteous people.
I get arguing with them once they propose a fine, but hey, if they ask you a question, give them the information.
You would be surprised how many organizations would not be willing to cooperate with a supervisory authority. I'm sure we'll have some more examples in the future. So on that note, let's wrap up this week, and we'll see you everybody soon.
That was Serious Privacy.
This wraps up our podcast for this week. Please do share the episode with your friends and colleagues because we love to get more listeners. And join the conversation on LinkedIn or on Blue Sky. You'll find us under Serious Privacy on both platforms. You'll find Kay as Heart of Privacy, Ralph as IGR O'Brien, and myself as Europol B. Until next week, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye, y'all.
If you're a data protection or privacy professional, you already know the pressure. Non-stop regulatory change, AI oversight, internal demands, and the expectation to somehow stay ahead of it all. And the old patchwork of tools just isn't cutting it anymore.
No. That's why TrustArc created a modern privacy management platform powered by Arc Intelligence. The TrustArc platform brings your workflows, evidence, research, tasks, and applications all together in one unified and intelligent workspace so you don't waste time digging, clicking, or context switching.
With Ask Arc, your privacy assistant, you can ask plain language questions about laws, jurisdictions, or even your own program data and get credible, cited answers based on NIMBY research and more than 1,000 global laws. It's explainable, transparent, and purpose-built for data protection and privacy.
So if you need to add a vendor, create a cookie banner, or start an assessment, quick actions take formally complex tasks, turn them into bite-sized guided workflows to save you time.
It's a platform that thinks like you, works like you, and helps you move faster with confidence, whether you're a seasoned DPO or you're just getting started.
See how modern privacy gets done. Explore Arc at trustarc.com/serious-privacy. That's trustarc.com/serious-privacy.